Good afternoon, and I'm very pleased to see you here today. I'm going to try something. I haven't done this before, and I hope it works, but it is a tradition that's starting to appear in various parts of the world. I would like to make the statement that as a visitor on this land, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded land of the Ohlone people, and in particular that of the Yakutsk community. I recognize the long-standing presence of Indigenous peoples in this territory. This is something that I have seen in Australia and Canada, and it's starting to be used to give recognition to people who've come before, who may not be able to speak for themselves. And it seems especially appropriate for language community to recognize such things. And I also wanted to mention that I was very pleased to see that last week the Office of the President, not Mark Davis, but a little higher office, sent out a very touching and profound statement about Indigenous Peoples Day last week. So I'd encourage you all to use your favorite search engine and read that as well. Jeannette, please.
Thank you, Craig, very much. It's great to be able to respect the space and the people that came before us, as you said, and reminding us is vital. And I will make a point of reminding every time I have a presentation to do this. So today's presentation is going to focus on creating awareness of why we need to accelerate the implementation of the digital empowerment for the Indigenous communities. So in 2011, the UN declared that access to the internet is a basic human right. And this is very, very important. But what is left out of this statement and what we ask is in what language? Because the current data shows that 40% of the 7,000 or 6,500 languages used worldwide are in some level of endangerment. And although the experts have opposing opinions about the figures, they all agree that the Indigenous communities are particularly vulnerable when they don't have education in their language and when they don't have any digital support. In response to this, the UN declared 2019 as the International Year of Indigenous Languages and created awareness for the intersection of language rights and digital rights. This was so successful that immediately after, they declared 2022 to 2032 the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. In February 2020, there were about 500 participants from over 50 countries that gathered together under the UNESCO banner and invited by the Mexico government in Mexico City. And it was many different sectors of the industry, many different political people. There were ministers, there were academics, researchers, Indigenous leaders themselves. And what they decided to do is to create the Los Pinos Declaration. And this was very important because at the end of this high-level event, they had certain strategic recommendations to do. And the declaration emphasizes that Indigenous peoples' rights to freedom of expression, to an education in their own mother tongue, to participation in public life using their language is their right. It also highlights, the declaration, the importance of enabling the use of Indigenous languages in justice systems, in the media, in labor, and in health programs. But most importantly, it emphasized the need for digital technologies in supporting the use and the preservation of these languages. As we heard in the previous presentation, The declaration places the Indigenous people at the center of its recommendation under the slogan, "Nothing for us without us." And of course, this is a very loaded statement, but it does bring home to us a level of mistrust from the communities, and also a communication issue that is bringing to our awareness that we need to work on how we communicate with the Indigenous communities. Both Craig and myself have been in numerous conferences that have combined audiences of both Indigenous communities and technologists. And the one thing that we have realized is that, in fact, we do not speak the same language. And by here language, we don't mean the actual linguistic language, we mean the culture. So we're coming from an environment and a culture that deals with actions and deliverables. We see a problem, we solve the problem. Sometimes we see a problem 5 times faster than everybody else, and we see 5 moves further down the road. Well, Indigenous communities don't have that culture. And there is always a misunderstanding when we are trying to help them where they don't understand how we're trying to help them. So it's very, very important that we start being sensitive to the way they need to be spoken and the way that they need to understand themselves, and to be involved, but most importantly, for them to learn how to do these things themselves. So yes, we can do the script encoding, we can do the font creation, and we can do the keyboards, but wouldn't it be better if we actually help them learn how to do all of these things? We take these basic human rights for granted, but for the 40% of the endangered languages that are deemed endangered, they don't have access in their language to participate in any of these rights. And we're not talking about Aboriginal, Sub-Saharan, or tribes. We're talking about people in Salinas around the corner from us, where the families have come over. There's at least 8 Mayan languages spoken in Salinas. And in the family, not everybody speaks English. So they don't even know what their rights are. And if the child speaks English, the child will not know what the judicial and the healthcare rights are of, people living in the US. So it's very important for us to realize that their language is imperative for them to be able to participate in life itself. Again, I want to share something that Craig and myself have talked many times. When we were in Paris in the Language Technology for All that UNESCO did to highlight the end of the International Year of Indigenous Languages in December 2019, there were many, many Indigenous communities with their leaders. One of the things that everybody said to us was, I just want to have the same digital experience that everybody else has. And it was said to us time after time after time. So I want to, at this point, to ask Craig to share with us some of these communities, who they are, what they do, and their journeys for digitization. We will see a completely different picture. But one of the things that I want to say before I give the floor to Craig is that the most successful communities to digitize are the ones that have someone as an advocate who understands us, and it's not the other way around. And they're able to help their community do this. And sometimes it takes a lifetime for these people to do it. So what can we do to accelerate? And the first thing is to understand them more. Craig?
Thank you so much. I don't presume to know the answer to this, but I would like to explore what I have learned a little bit of what I've learned over the last several years. Language communities around the world are really good at knowing what they want for their communities, for their children, for their elders, and how they want their future language usage to continue. In fact, since language is such an integral part of people's identity almost anywhere or everywhere in the world, they know what's going on. Here's an example of a group that we've been recently in contact with called the Sunuwar Welfare Society. Now, most of us probably hadn't heard of Sunuwar 2 years ago, or maybe 5 minutes ago. Sunuwar is a language with about 40,000 people who speak it in eastern Nepal and Sikkim, which is now a part of India. Those two communities have a language that has been used for a long, long time, but it's mostly written in Devanagari or not at all. It is not very much used in education, and so like many communities, they see their language used at home, but the children see very little use of it in the community. They don't see it printed anywhere. They don't feel like the language is something that they need to learn. And like many communities, when the children stop learning the language, when the children have no enthusiasm or reason to be excited about it, very often parents see their children losing it. Another, we'll give a better or some more information about the Sunuwar initiatives that are happening in a few moments. When Jeannette and many others were at the UNESCO meeting in December of 2019, my last airplane trip, we were confronted, I think that's an appropriate word, by the Sami community. The Sami community from northern Norway mostly, but also from Finland and Sweden, is not one language. It might be 7, might be more languages, but they have political power within their countries. They have money and they have influence. They're actually ministers from the Sami community that came to Paris and basically hit us over the head with a manifesto for open language technology. And it's worth looking this up because it really changed my point of view of what we as technologists should be doing, what we should be hoping for, and what we can expect. I don't think all of these things are going to happen anytime soon, but it's really important to understand why they're asking for things like open localization. They're not asking Google or Apple or Microsoft or anybody to translate everything, but they want to say, but let us translate your product. Controversial, but a good question. Why couldn't we? And what would it take to open things up? Open interfaces so that instead of people typing Sami when they have their system set to Norwegian because they can't set their system language to Sami, to get everything underlined as being misspelled because they think, boy, these people type Norwegian very badly. So they want to have the ability to put a spell checker that they have designed into products that exist out there. Again, can this happen easily? I don't know. But without people asking for it, we wouldn't even think of it. They talk about open resources. They suggest that everything that a company, that an organization, that a university has in their language should be available to the people of that community to have ownership of, to examine, to correct, and to extend, rather than it being controlled by somebody else. And that accessible standards should be developed so that not only are the standards developed for the big languages, the languages where people have money and power, but also they should be considering all languages of the world without those resources. So take a look at openlt.org and you may learn a few things. I want to thank the Cherokee Nation. About 10 years ago, I met someone from the Cherokee Nation, and quite by chance, we started talking about his name, Black Fox, and my company and my job, and we got started, and we worked on ideas about how to do things with the Cherokee language. They had done the hard work of getting Cherokee into the Unicode standard. Cherokee has a syllabary. The first things are not CWY, but they are tsa, la, gi, 3 syllables of the 85 or 86 character syllabary. And the Cherokee have a long tradition of technology, starting way back from before they were removed from Georgia and North Carolina about 200 years ago. They were ready adopters of many things that the white people were bringing to their area. And a man named Sequoyah invented the writing system. He never learned English. He absolutely refused to learn English because he was rather upset about other things happening because of the white people coming to the area. But very quickly, once the syllabary was invented and given to the Cherokee Nation, they quickly became more literate than the white people around them. And that led to success, which may have led partly to their removal to Oklahoma. And the Trail of Tears is a story that is not the best of American history, let's say, where 1/3 of the people died, literally on the road. But they have a long tradition of literacy because very quickly after their script was developed, somebody said, let's make metal type for this. And so the metal type foundry that produced the first Cherokee script simplified it from the handwritten form, and it became kind of baked in lead, literally, and allowed them to write books, read books, develop technologies develop universities and an educational system. And they were training more lawyers and doctors per capita than the white population of the United States at that time. It didn't prevent them from having Andrew Jackson come with guns and say, you're moving, but it did give them an identity, and it gave them tremendous power. Everything's not perfect in the Cherokee Nation. Some people still live in the hills of North Carolina, the Eastern Band, and the Cherokee folks have actually 2 governments in Oklahoma that don't get along very well, but they still have their identity, partly due to the fact that they have their own script. And I've said many of these things already. I like to talk rather than hit the slide button. But the most important point is that this was developed by them. They are the ones who went to IBM and said, or to typewriter manufacturers and said, build us a typewriter, we'll pay for it. They're the ones who went to IBM eventually. Some of you may remember the Selectric type ball. There were 3 Cherokee Selectric type balls written, not different ones, 3 instances of that. Very, very expensive, but they were used by the Cherokee Nation to produce documents in the 1970s, 80s, and so on. They still exist. They're museum pieces now, of course, but it shows you their enthusiasm. One brief note I heard when I met the Cherokee was that they were an innovator in another way. When the telephone first came to the United States, they were the first organization west of the Mississippi River to have a telephone. And the Cherokee man answered the phone and was remarkably astonished that this device speaks Cherokee. And so now, 200 years later, many years later, we can talk that same way with the internet because they've developed much of the technology in association with Unicode and other organizations. The computer technology has advanced quite a bit, and Apple is one of the first groups that actually coordinated with them on building a special Cherokee keyboard, which you can see on the mobile device at the upper right. And they have been remarkably successful in using the language. And one of the big innovations is their immersion schools, where they're having young kids from the age of 2 or 3 in entirely Cherokee-speaking environments. And that is amazingly helping their parents, who are the lost generation of Cherokee speakers, because the parents did not live with their grandparents. And grandparents, it turns out, for Indigenous languages are one of the main sources of literacy and ability to speak Indigenous languages. When you improve the housing situation in the Indian nations, you give the grandparents their own houses, but you nuke the language transmission to the grandchildren. And so these kids from the immersion schools are going back to their homes, and their parents are being inspired, in many cases, to start learning Cherokee themselves. Is it going to save the language? Is it going to let this language survive the 21st century? I don't know. But because the kids can text each other and lie to their parents about where they're going after school, in Cherokee, there's a good chance. The language is innovating, and the elders, I've been told, are somewhat upset about the way the young people are changing the language, inventing neologisms, and so on. But that's what language does. Oh, also, one thing. In Cherokee, many of the elders were also upset when people started inventing new fonts, developing new styles for the font, because it was baked into metal type. And that's all they ever saw as a printed form. And so it's taken years for people to be comfortable with different styles. Very interesting. It ain't just text. So the Cherokee technology today is really advancing, and they are working very hard to advance their language. Their elders are involved in all aspects of their conversation, but the young people are getting involved as well. So not only their newspapers and publications, but they have their own print shop for their immersion schools. And the picture down at the lower left shows you the excitement when they first see the Cherokee language online. Incidentally, we developed Google's search interface to the Cherokee language. Not that many people use it, as you heard from the previous talk, perhaps. The user interface isn't as important as the fact that the Cherokee language was recognized by somebody other than the Cherokee people. And there was one little bug in the Chrome operating system that when Cherokee was first introduced into Google search, CHR is the code. Somebody in the Chrome system had said, oh, CHR is a special code for Chrome. And somehow when Cherokee language was introduced to Google search, Chromebooks all over the world started outputting in Cherokee. And millions of people saw the Cherokee language and wondered, what the hell is this? And the Cherokee people were thrilled by this because they got tremendous recognition. So, exactly, quite interesting. So I want to thank the Cherokee for what they've done for me. They've not only opened my eyes to a lot of things I never saw before, but they've opened my heart to them as well, because that is, they've given me true connections to many things that I never would have expected, and it's led to all sorts of things. One of the most recent connections is with the Sunuwar language. I mentioned about Nepal and Sikkim. They have a unique writing system that was only developed really in the 1940s, 1950s. It isn't very old, it hasn't been used a lot, and there is not a huge amount of literacy in their own language, except maybe in Devanagari. But they have this script. A Unicode proposal was developed in 2011. It is being reinvigorated now, and that is partly because we have some connections with them and we've offered some help to them, and they've helped us see how we can assist them and making connections between scholars and researchers and the Unicode community seems to be putting them on the path toward getting their writing system now. And they're sending us pictures of printed materials, posters, signage, not just the handwritten things, but actual printed materials that are starting to appear in the community and tweaking people's interest in learning how to read and write their own language. So that is pretty amazing. And it isn't hurting now that they are developing more cross-border collaboration as well. Do I keep going? Is this still mine? Okay. The challenges are, of course, that for any language community, children may not be learning the language. It's not cool. One of my Cherokee friends said, all you have to do is give the kids the cool tools in Cherokee, and they will learn the language. If you can give them a game in Cherokee, if you can make sure that they can read and write the news or use it on social media, give them a keyboard, give them a font, they're off and running. That will keep the language going and it will extend it. So the reading and writing tools, but if there's no Unicode, no mobile. If there's no keyboard or font, they might be able to read something or maybe not. But until these basic things are there, as Luke and Mark and Dan suggested in the previous thing, it's very difficult to advance. But once those things are there, provided by you folks and a lot of others, a lot of things can happen, such as educational materials. One of the things that we would like to do is identify educational materials that are available that can be translated for free into many of these languages. Not do the translations for them, but give them the materials and let them use appropriate materials so that they can not start from absolute nothing, but start from a higher place in their educational process. And of course, they don't have the tech community available to us. We are rather spoiled here that we can call somebody or that we can find something online in our language to tell us how to use all these things, but they don't have that. And partnerships are not very well developed. And the biggest thing, which you probably have all heard about with respect to Native American communities such as the Navajo, is people are dying. And COVID, one of the tragedies of COVID is that it's been killing people who speak these languages, especially in places like the Navajo Nation and many indigenous communities in the United States and elsewhere. So we don't want the world to be a tofu place for them. And here's where we would like to play the video. This is from Dev Sunuwar. His last name, or the name he uses, his last name is the same as the language, the same as the community's name.
Namaste. My name is Dev Kumar Sunuwar. I represent Sunuwar Welfare Society, the umbrella and the national representative organization of Sunuwar Indigenous Peoples of Nepal, which was founded in 1988. Sunuwar is Indigenous Peoples of Nepal, officially recognized as one of the 59 Indigenous peoples by Government of Nepal. The population of Sunuwar is about 56,000, of which 38,000 speak their own mother tongue called Sunuwar language or Koinchlo. Sunuwar language is not written widely, nor is it used to write literature extensively. It is spoken at home and at the community level widely as the community language. Nepali language has been imposed as official language. Therefore, Nepali language only has been used as only language for government administrative work, education, and also a language in the media. Therefore, the indigenous languages in Nepal, including Sunuwar language, has been marginalized for centuries. We, Sunuwar indigenous peoples, have our own script, but this script has remained mainly in handwriting because of lack of Unicode standard and true type font. We have been dependent on Devanagari script and English to communicate in text, in social platform, and also to publish articles in the websites and all the printed world. The government of Nepal now is open enough and acknowledged the importance of mother tongue educations. The government of Sikkim in India recognized Sunuwar language as one of the official languages in 1996 and started publishing official government materials in Sunuwar script. But these publications mostly remained in handwriting form for many years. Since 2020, with the support from Translation Common team, we have been trying to digitize and transfer the Sunuwar, the oral language, into writing systems or writing languages. Thanks to a Translation Common to facilitate this initiative. Without you, it was impossible for us to get to know about the Unicode systems, the ways how to approach them, and also tell how important it is to digitize these Sunuwar indigenous languages. And now we have a dream that once Sunuwar script has Unicode and built in a system, we will be able to digitize our stories, knowledge, and language, and ultimately pass on to the next generations. We also have a dream that a Sunuwar script will be available and it will be accessible on all kinds of devices without the converter, and will be possible to type and possible to use them on online website and other social medias, so that we will be able to document our indigenous knowledge and, more importantly, the language which have been transmitted orally for generations. And we will be able to use Sunuwar script in educations, in media, in information and the communications, which ultimately will be helpful in preservation and promotion of oral language into our writings. Thank you once again on behalf of Sunuwar Welfare Society for your support to digitize the Sunuwar script. Namaste.
So let's move on.
I wanted to share with you the importance to the community to have an advocate like Dev. He not only speaks English and can speak with us, but he understands the concepts and he understands what needs to be done in a completely different culture than his own, and he's able to translate that for his own community. And I'm very pleased we were able to share this video with you to show that they didn't even know they could digitize. And what happened is we met at the Mexico City high-level UNESCO event, and at the time, because the International Year of Indigenous Languages had just finished, our team decided to launch the Language Digitization Initiative that the next session will give you some more information on and the projects we're working on. But at the time that we launched it, we were looking for a pilot community to help them, handhold them, and to document all the steps that are required to be done by the community, but from both ends, both from us as technologists, but also from the community themselves. And once this is documented, then it could be given to the UNESCO International Decade of Indigenous Languages to model it and to scale it up to other languages that wish to go through the same. Now, I'm not going to go and tell you about the process for digitization here because, you know, you all know this. And in the previous presentation, Luke gave us a lot of information, which is very similar. Oh, this was yours, Craig. Okay. But of course, you know, we want to talk about the writing system. The writing system needs to be in the Unicode standard, which we know. The fonts need to be able to be displayed and the characters need to be displayed as expected. The input methods like the keyboards, we need to create them. There are tools in order to be able to share text, word lists, dictionaries, online content. To be able to identify the language of text, audio, video, spell checks, word suggestions, speech to text, text to speech, and machine translations. Basically, it's exactly what Luke said in his slide with different words. Some of the pitfalls are that we assume we know what the community wants, and we know how they want to use their language. And we always forget that language evolves. And we already had an example that Craig shared about the youngsters and the email of the Cherokee, which is called now Lightning Paper. I want to share another example of the Maori community where they themselves don't have these terms of email and you know, texting and all these words, and they allow the young generation to come up with these terms, and they come to them with various terms, and then they monitor how the terms are used. And within a few months, if there is a winner, then that winner becomes the official language. So the actual committee, the linguistic committee of the Maori language is on top of the language and texting and everything, and makes those decisions based on usage. So another thing that is important is that we expect the agreement on the communities of their needs and wants. This is very, very important because we may think they need the font to be this way, but they want it a completely different way. We have no idea why, you know, the sound does not represent, you know, the specific character, and why one little change to that character, you know, for them identifies that sound specifically. assuming that the basic tools can be used by everyone. As we know, not everybody has desktops. One of the things that we have found in Latin America, for example, is that it's mostly mobiles, it's mostly phones. And we also assume that people who are older, are not using phones. They do. They use the phones because that's the only way they stay in touch with family. And if it isn't in their language, and some of these older people don't speak the dominant language, so we can't assume a lot of things. We can't impose a solution that has worked for another group. Every group is very different. And sometimes we're not very sensitive at listening at the feedback that we get. And sometimes we underestimate the need to establish and maintain long-term relationships and partnerships. And sometimes it's not our fault, but it does happen. So in summary, the digital platforms can enable language communities. It requires some basic technology support. Partnerships need to be between technology and providers and community leaders, and language vitality can promote community health. Before we finish, I want to share this with you. This particular workflow, we call it workflow, it's really not a workflow and it's not linear, but it's how we perceive language technology for Indigenous languages or for all languages. And this shows us that all languages are not equal. It shows that some languages are now just beginning their journey with script encoding or font creation. Then we have to make sure that the terminology is existing, that there is grammars, that there are tools and educational material. Then we have to have content. And again, we have the example of allowing the users the ability and the time to use and create the content. Without education, we know that the language cannot survive. Employment is a very important thing because it works both ways. Also, for having the digital ability gives employment to the communities, but also if we can train people to become translators and interpreters for their community, it opens up that window of communication with the rest of the world. And finally, the automation tools. And machine translation for some communities may be the, holy grail, but nonetheless, it is so many other things that are involved in advanced automation. Now, the most important thing in this chart, let's say, is not the sequence or not all the elements. It's the fact that it's all based on partnerships. No one community can do it alone. No one country can do it alone. No one international agency can do it alone, and no nonprofit, most importantly, no Indigenous community can do it alone. So the decade ahead of us is an opportunity for all of us to create multi-stakeholder partnerships that will have the same goal. So on this, I want to ask you to join as a volunteer. I know you're volunteers here in Unicode, and I would love to volunteer for Unicode too, but also the fact that perhaps Unicode and Translation Commons could have a partnership where we can work together from different angles. Thank you. And feel free to contact me on my email. Thank you.
so the Sami people could yell at us in person, if nothing else. But also, the Brothers Berry were there because with their Adon script and the people from Nigeria were there yelling at me because Latin fonts don't do Yoruba correctly. And the Cherokee folks were there, and getting people in the same room was the first thing. I don't know how to make governments work very well, but I do know that in the ballot I just put in, or just sent in the mail, and yes, voting does work, I don't know, that the instructions for my one question ballot included 6 languages, including Burmese. I was surprised and pleased. And when I got my Social Security, admitting my age, Social Security note saying sign up, there were 3 pages of instructions in different languages. So I think there's some recognition. Those are interesting to me. In a lot of those languages, I couldn't figure out what languages they were. But I think there's possibilities. But making people aware that this is just one big thing. I've ridden the bike ride across Iowa for 5 times. And one time I went to a little town where all the signs were in Spanish. There's a chicken processing plant in town. I was surprised at that, but it's been a long time since I lived there. But there was one place that had signs in the Burmese script, a Burmese restaurant with one of these refugee communities in that town. So we are more diverse than many people like to pretend.
And I also want to add that Translation Commons became partner to the International Bureau of Indigenous Languages, and that gave us access to various high-level events, and we were able to be invited when they were speaking with the various members of the countries. And at the end of the decade, every single member country had to present to the General Assembly what they did in the year as part of the imperative of the year that they had signed on themselves before. So there was a change of policy, and of course many countries took it on and created the policies for indigenous languages. Mexico was one of the most active countries. Russia was very active as well. So there were a lot, not to just name the 2 of them, but in the decade, I was invited to be a member of the ad hoc committee for creating the Global Action Plan. And we were about 80 people, and most of them from different governments from all over the world that are members of UNESCO, but also some nonprofits, academics, and of course a lot of indigenous communities themselves. And it was very interesting that no matter how we as a nonprofit, we talk every time and say, we need to have a language technology framework. It has to be imperative. And it is there. It has been there from the beginning. But we couldn't get down to the details until the Russian representative said, we have to have ISO for new languages. We have to have, localization. We have to have ABCD. The minute the country said that, immediately I got an email saying, and I was there at the meeting, but I got an email saying, okay, how do we create this framework? And this is basically a lesson for all of us. The country, asks for it, it gets written down. It's a bureaucracy, it's political, they have to do everything according to the book. Now that it's written, we can now help the communities. We have that framework coming up, and it's us. What we need to do is make sure that we have experts and representatives from the organizations, from the applications, and from all the different steps that languages and communities need to do. And as we've seen in that graph, a language can have the script and the keyboard and content, but not educational material. Or they can have educational material, but they don't have the employment opportunities. They don't have the translators and interpreters. So there's a lot of stuff. A lot of us are talking about data, parallel data for under-resourced languages. All of this needs to happen together under a multi-stakeholder partnership. It cannot be done by one one organization.
I'm reminded of a phrase I've heard fairly recently. It was regarding climate change, and one of the things people ask is, what can one person do? And the best answer is, stop being one person. And that's what Unicode is, in some sense, doing. That's what people are doing together. So thank you for the question, and accept the very long-winded answer.
So I think that's the end of, they actually did the timing a little off.